Hello and welcome. I'm David Distelhorst, local history librarian at Bexley Public Library. We're so excited to have Dr. Scott King-Owen with us this evening, and I see many of his students as well. And now for a few upcoming programs. Join us on Thursday, February 23rd at 7 p.m. for Smile for We, Seeing Black Men in a Different Light with author Damon Mosley. Also on Thursday, March 16th at 7 p.m. for Women Who Tell Our Stories with author Marilyn Greenwald. Copies of our program guide are available on your way out, and you can find all programs and registration for them on our website, bexleylibrary.org. And now a few words of introduction about tonight's speaker. Scott King-Owen earned his Ph.D. in early American history at The Ohio State University in 2011. Although he is a specialist in early America, he has since coming to Bexley, been interested in researching late 19th century suburban development and the geography of race relations. He serves as trustee of the Bexley Historical Society and teaches courses in American history, anthropology, and psychology at Bexley High School. Welcome, Dr. Scott King-Owen.
Well, thank you for being here. Am I too loud? Loud enough? Thumbs up? Okay, good. I appreciate all of you coming out on this night. Colleagues, friends, new friends, so welcome. Thank you to Whitney and David for putting this program together. So what we're going to try to do tonight is use the history that I've been working on to explore some issues about the way in which we do history. Meaning, particularly in African American history, it's quite difficult sometimes to find what we might call the truth or get enough of the facts to know what's going on. So what I want to do tonight with the story of Bexley's first Black landowner is try to explore the limits of what's knowable, where we might have conjecture, what do the primary sources tell us, and how are all of those stories remembered, which is another aspect of what we're doing tonight. So with that being said, I'd like to begin with a memory, in fact. So in 1977, the founder and actually probably the single most important force in the preservation of Bexley history, Edie Mae Harrell, interviewed Mrs. Harold W. Brown. And Mrs. Brown grew up in South Bexley, where she was Mary Wilkins before she got married. And at the time of the interview, Mary was about 79. And so Edie Mae got a chance to ask her, what do you remember about growing up in Bexley? What are the things that you can recall? And she gave some information about the subject of tonight's talk, who is Thomas Payton. So we're going to use her memories as a springboard into what we can learn, what we can know, what are the limits of our knowledge. We can kind of test that memory against what the primary sources say. The first thing is she mentions that Thomas Payton's name is Patton. She wasn't sure how to spell it. And that's not a surprise. 19th century records, people don't know how to spell their own names. Spelling in early America is never really standard for a lot of folks. She remembered that he was a slave from the Civil War, that his master gave him the property at 850 College Avenue. And that property there today, owned by another family, still in existence. The time of her meeting with Thomas Payton, she recalled that they were the only African Americans in Bexley when her father bought the property just a few houses down. She said that he was about 90 when she met him. He had beautiful white hair and would sit in his front yard behind a picket fence and was about half blind. she would stop and talk with him, which I'm very jealous of that fact, given what we're doing now tonight. And she would do that on her way home from East High School, because at that time, Bexley did not have its own separate high school, and our students had to go to East. And then she recorded, interestingly enough, that apparently in the course of conversing with him, that he had a daughter who went berserk, her words, and that African Americans, as a general rule, did not get divorces. That gives us a list of testable facts. And we're going to try to see which of those facts hold up, which of her memories at age 79 can be matched up to the historical record. What I'd like to say in general about this from the psychological perspective is that sometimes it's really hard when you think about not being able to remember what you did yesterday. Memory by its nature is reconstructive. As you change, grow, have new experiences, the memories that you have layer on top of old memories. They get rewritten and reworked. So I'm really curious at how much Mrs. Brown remembered accurately at age 79. The other thing I'd like to remember, and this is another key lesson from psychology, is that we like to think we know what people in the past were doing because we feel like as humans, they're like us. And to a certain extent, people are people. They've been doing the same things for thousands of years. We eat, we drink, we fall in love, we accumulate property. But the mental universes of people generations removed from us might actually be quite different from our own. So we have to be careful in assuming that we know what historical actors in the past were thinking and feeling in a given situation, even if we think we might be able to infer that based on what we know. So let's explore together and see what we can figure out. And there's probably no better place to start than the Civil War, because that's one of Mary's memories. And that's in fact where Thomas Payton shows up in the historical record. In the ending of the war, Thomas Payton, skip too far. He shows up in 1864 in Middleport, Ohio, where he enlists to fight for the Union. And he gives, as part of his enlistment information, that he's from Malden, West Virginia, which, if you know African-American history, you might know that's where Booker T. Washington was from as well. Malden, West Virginia at the time was just becoming West Virginia. Virginia was a state in the South in the Civil War, and the northern part seceded and formed its own separate state during the course of the war. 5'3" tall Thomas Payton would consistently later say that he was from Virginia. And so kind of makes sense if you'd grown up throughout your childhood living in Virginia, that a minor geographical change and a new state forming wouldn't have much of an impression upon you. The other thing that we learn from his first encounter with the historical record is that he could have not been from Malden, but merely stopped there on his way to Ohio. And that is a possibility that I've had to contend with, because I went looking for evidence that he was enslaved in West Virginia. So if he's enslaved in West Virginia, what would he be doing there? Would you like to take a guess? I heard tobacco. What else? Mining, coal. Those are good guesses for West Virginia. Cotton. Salt. Kanawha County, West Virginia was an early center of salt production. As far back as 1797, they were producing 150 bushels of salt per day. And these salt production facilities had both enslaved workers and free African Americans, which then gives us another problem. Is he a slave from the Civil War, or was he a free man who worked in these salt production facilities? It's really hard to say. So I went looking for evidence of enslavement, and I couldn't find any. I also couldn't find any evidence in particular that he did work in the salt industry, because let me read to you the number of other occupations that he could have been involved in according to the 1860 industrial census. Carriage making, barrel production, sawmill, saddlery, tannery, grist mill, foundry, blacksmithing. There was a shoe and boot factory, and oil. That last one kind of surprised me. And it turns out salt employed 263 people in Kanawha County in West Virginia. Oil had 195 workers in the 1860 industrial census. So oil also could have been a possibility. There were 181 free African Americans in the county. So I went ahead and read the 1860 census front to back. No Thomas Payton. So that turned out to be a dead end. There were people that if he had been in the condition of being in slavery, that he could have been owned by a John R. Payton, a Joseph Payton, and a George Patton. But then I read all their census records as well, and I couldn't really find any proof that he was in their households as an enslaved person. So Mary said that he was a slave from the Civil War. We can't either confirm or disprove that at this point. So the story will continue to evolve. And one time that I can get out and do more research in West Virginia, road trip, if you want to come, let me know. We'll mine the records together. We might turn up something. So perhaps he was from Malden, perhaps not. Perhaps he was enslaved, perhaps not. And even more interesting is the nature of his family, because they will play a huge role in his life. This is also difficult. African-American genealogy is notoriously hard. In terms of enslavement, Southerners kept records when it mattered that you had to record details about property. Who's a good worker? What's their productive value? But when you want to record details that we might find interesting, you don't see that a lot in the records. What we do know, based on later information, is that Thomas had parents, Benjamin and Sarah, and I can't find anything about them. I've looked all through Virginia census records. So that's not a surprise, but also just continue to do more research. What I was able to show and demonstrate over the last few years of working on this is his siblings and the close nature of their relationship. So his oldest sister was Caroline. Next was Amanda, Charlotte, Thomas, and the last was the young brother, Gabriel. Interestingly enough, Caroline named her children Benjamin after her father, Gabriel after her brother, and Amanda after her sister. So I would infer the family was fairly close-knit and able to stay connected at least up into the Civil War. And then certainly after the Civil War, we will see that connection flourish here in Bexley as well. So we now have a man that we know something about and yet not enough. We'd want to know more. I've worked on this for quite some time, so my ancestry bill is pretty high. Any of you do genealogy? You pay for ancestry, that $19.95 a month, or it's a $24 a month, I think now. So I maintain a Thomas Payton family tree in addition to my own family tree. And this is a constant source of like obsessive checking to see if there's something new. And as far as I can tell, this is where we are at the moment with Thomas there in the middle, his parents, brothers and sisters, and then his children, whom we will get to in a minute. So how does Thomas end up in Bexley? Well, first thing I'd like to say is he's not the first African-American in Bexley. He might be the first landowner that we've documented, but not the first African-American. At the time he appears in Bexley in 1868, we've already been able to document tenant farming African-Americans in this community, renting land from the absentee landowners who own large acres of property here. The 1860 census, for example, shows Reuben Commander, who was a native of North Carolina with $300 in personal property, but no real property, no actually landed property, farming 85 acres that he did not own, worth $5,000, growing corn, potatoes, and hay. We also have Timothy Weaver, a farmer raising pigs, wheat, and corn. Interesting was a painter from Virginia, Henry Higginbottom, who earned enough money to actually buy his own land, just not in Bexley. He bought land off Mount Vernon, so on the east side. At the time that Payton comes to Bexley, his neighbors would have consisted then of absentee landowners, people farming tenant relationships, as well as people like the Livingstons, D.W. Brooks, Isaac Aston, Michael Kuhn, Anthony Rule. You might recognize that name. Some of these names survive in streets in North Bexley. Andrew Vogel, John Fry, it's spelled F-R-E-Y, but every census taker spells it F-R-Y, which probably is indicating it's Fry, German. Henry Lutz, Henry Schlitt, J. Rudolph, who owned the land where the high school now sits, A.S. Ramsey, E. Schneider, and the Millers, who own land both in Bexley and then just across in what would be Whitehall. People like Dr. Lincoln Goodale, you might recognize that name, Goodale Park, owned land here, just didn't live here. Ohio's Attorney General, Henry Stanberry, you might recognize the name because Stanberry survives as a North Bexley development. These folks purchased land here in the early 19th century when it was cheap, and the only thing going through here was essentially a plank road. The Granville and Columbus Plank Railroad, which was opened in 1823, followed by the National Road in 1833, which we all call, if you live here, Main Street. Though in the 19th century, they also called it Friend Street. And many of these folks owned this property with the intent of one day they knew it would be valuable. In early American history, we call these land speculators, and every early American did it. George Washington was a land speculator, Thomas Jefferson, land speculator. Everyone bought land cheap with the hope one day they knew the frontier would no longer be unsettled and you could make a nice buck if you could sell it. So this area that Thomas Payton would come to does have African Americans in it. It has a hotel, Hotel Pleasant Ridge, operated by Christian Linneman, which would have been at College and Main Street. And as far as I can tell from maps, there are about 22 houses on the map. And that won't change very much, except with Payton's arrival. 1868, Halloween. That's a key date in Bexley history because that's when the deed for Thomas Payton's property is recorded. 19.5 acres at a cost of $1,765. Would you like to guess how much that would be today? $34,000. So what does that tell us? Thomas Payton was a hardworking man. He accumulated money and was able to take that money and buy something that every 19th and 18th century American valued: land. Land was the guarantor of your economic prosperity. In early America in the 18th century, it was the guarantor for citizenship, since you had to have it in order to be able to vote. So land is what was valued, and labor, hard work, got that for him. The land that he bought was held in trust by the Barr family. The father, Samuel Barr, had bought a lot of the property along Broad Street because he also was an investor in the Granville-Columbus Plank Road. So, no surprise, you invest in the Plank Road, you have property along the Plank Road, one day you hope to sell it. Except Barr died without a will, and the land went to his children. The most visible reminder of the Barr family in Bexley is an octagonal house on Broad Street. Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. That was Elizabeth Barr's house, built between 1853 and 1856 on land she got from her dad. And apparently the Barrs lived there together, brother, sister, and their adopted sister, Susan Ashton. Fascinating story there, which maybe someday I'll get a chance to tell about Susan. The Barr land was held in trust, so the trustee had to sell it on behalf of John Barr, and apparently the Barrs did this very often, so gradually they lose their foothold in Bexley. They had a homestead on Main Street at Alum Creek, and that's no longer there, so they get pretty much eliminated from the area. So the guy who actually sells the land to Thomas is Nathaniel Marion, who is a local real estate developer. And I wish we knew more about the transaction. Did the Barrs just need money? How did they feel about an African-American buying into the community? African-Americans had lived here, so maybe having this person buy land didn't seem all that problematic for them. We just don't know. We would love to know more about the lived experience of Payton in the community and what his neighbors thought of him, but we just don't know. Who were his neighbors? Well, his closest neighbor was a gentleman farmer named D.W.C. Sawyer, and Sawyer owned the land where CSG is now located. Largest of the parcels in Bexley. To the north of Payton was Ernst, a shoemaker from Germany. And then to the east was William Norwalk, Joseph Smith, and Susanna Brands. We don't know much about these folks at all. The other major large landowner was George McCalla, who owned the land where Wolf Park was located. And that's where the remains of a mound were situated, about 75 feet around and about 15 feet tall. And the McCalla family excavated it in the 1880s. The artifacts are now in the Ohio Historical Connection. There's a skeleton, some tools, things like that. So apart from Payton, there are not too many neighbors here. There is a school, and the school is at the intersection of Cassidy and Broad, presumably for the German Catholic families who live north. So the Rules, the Vogels, those folks. And there was a cemetery at Stanwood. So Stanwood and Broad had a Catholic cemetery. The bodies are no longer there. They were disinterred and moved. So what does that look like on the map? This map is from 1856. And so you can see on it the Barrs right there. You can see the school. You can see J. Rudolph. That's where the high school is located now. So right over from there would have been the Paytons and the Paytons' neighbors. Down here, you can see the Barr homestead, the crossing over Main Street or Friend Street, and then on into Bexley. And there is the hotel, Pleasant Ridge. which at the time that Payton arrived in Bexley had just been ransacked by two criminal brothers who apparently tore the place like to pieces. And then one of them was wanted for murder, and it resulted in a huge manhunt. But that's a story for another day. This is the first map where we can see that the Paytons actually are on the map. But making it hard to know who they are is the fact that Thomas Payton's name is P-A-T-E-N on this map, not P-A-Y-T-O-N. Once again, spelling the 19th century. But you can see right there. What's interesting is this 19.5 acres gets divided up between the family members. Thomas buys in 1868. In 1874, he sells it to his brothers and sisters and his nephew. Charlotte, Amanda, Gabriel, and Benjamin Fields, his sister Charlotte's son. Amanda paid $600. Ben Fields, her son, paid $337. Charlotte paid $425. Gabriel paid $90. So I don't know what got Gabriel the good deal, but they worked out something there. There's no real clear difference between the property, why certain property was valued at a certain level versus others. But I would suspect, if I'm using my historical imagination, that this is a family affair. And so maybe ability to pay, regard for brothers and sisters. This earned Thomas $1,452 back from his original $1,700 investment. So if you go back to Miss Mary Brown, the land was given to him by his former owner. Yeah, we're going to have to cross that one off. That does not hold up. Thomas moved to this area and bought property with his own labor. And then his family came here and they paid him for that property, which then implies they were able to earn money as well and then buy into this community. So what did they do with it? Well, like most of Payton's neighbors, they farmed. That couldn't have been their only source of income, though, because Thomas actually mortgaged the property for $5,000 and paid it off in 10 years. This is an industrious man. And farming doesn't show up in the 1880 census as a very, very highly income generating activity for the Paytons. Gabriel Payton is listed in the agricultural census of 1880 in charge of 12 acres, raising livestock and producing $150 worth of farm products. I suspect that Payton and his brother Gabriel worked other kinds of jobs. And they're described in many of the records as teamsters. Do you know what a teamster is? You didn't think you were getting quizzed tonight, did you? It's a wagon driver. Now we think today Teamster like Teamsters Union. So 20th century Jimmy Hoffa, you know, where is Jimmy? Who knows? All that sort of stuff. But it's a wagon driver in the 19th century. And Thomas and Gabriel both are described as teamsters and laborers. So it's very highly likely that they got a lot more money doing that. And maybe that's how Thomas met his wife, who's also very interesting because her name is never consistent in any of the records. Annie Ball Pearl, quite a bit younger. Thomas was born in 1830. She was born in 1861. So the different, little bit of a gap there between them. And as far as I can tell, she was born in Washington, Pennsylvania, though some sources say Washington, D.C., and I think that's a mistake. I think people heard Washington and assumed it was D.C. That's only about 160 miles from Bexley on the National Road, and you could get there by train. So the train that runs to the top of Bexley at Fifth Avenue would take you to Washington as well. They were married in September of 1879, and their daughter Katie followed in 1880. A second daughter, Henrietta, who goes by Reddy May, comes in 1884. And then their last child we will talk about in a minute when we get to some controversial parts of the Payton family history. It's during these early settlement years of the 1880s that he loses his oldest sister, Caroline, and she will be buried in Green Lawn, where actually most of the Paytons, they will all end up. And David has actually been there, so he's seen the unmarked grave for the family, the half plot. Two things are going to happen at the end of the 1880s that will dramatically change the Payton world. And the first is going to be a Philadelphia lawyer. The Philadelphia lawyer is Logan Bullitt, the son of John C. Bullitt, and both were land speculators. The Bullitts bought property all along Broad Street, including Bexley. At the time, Bexley was known as the Bluffs Beyond Alum Creek. So where the Granville Plank Road or Broad Street went, that sort of rise that you see as you're coming across Alum Creek, those were the bluffs. And that farmland would become a new subdivision in the 1890s. The Bullitts were loaded. They showed up into town and offered $19,000 for Payton's property, the equivalent of $595,000 today. I've actually done the math. Bullitt in that time period paid $121,000 for all the property around where CSG is at Drexel Circle. So this is a very wealthy man who has a hope of building a new subdivision, and that story will play out not quite the way he wants. And he'll get bored and turn over the property to somebody else, but not without leaving his name attached to it as Bullitt Park. The Paytons are now flush with cash. Annie is pregnant with their third child, and this is where their family history becomes dramatic in a huge way, because Annie files for divorce. And I find this part kind of difficult to talk about, because if you think about your own experience and your own family secrets and like your dirty laundry, you can't imagine, I don't think, at some point in the future, some historian digging through your records, right? What would that look like? What would they not get right? What would they misunderstand? How would they be able to understand what you went through, the difficult experience of the ending of that relationship? And so I've thought a lot about this divorce and what it means, because I don't know that we'll ever know fully, truly what went on between them. But it was not pretty, as divorces happen to be, because Annie got a restraining order against Thomas in 1889, accusing him of being a drunkard for the last 3 years, failing to provide for his family in the plainest style, which is a very common thing you see in divorces. Like, he won't even buy me the cheapest things, forcing her to work, and being cruel and abusive. She said that Thomas had accused her of cheating on him and suggesting that their last child was not a legitimate child of his. So how do we know what went on? We just don't. I've read the original divorce record, the handwritten manuscript, but it also appeared in the newspaper. The forerunner to the Columbus Dispatch summarized every single detail of the court. Everything. You imagine your business for everyone in Columbus to read. What is interesting is that Thomas didn't back down. He hired his own attorneys, a very well-known firm in Columbus, went into court, and countered her divorce petition with his own request for the court. So this is a man with a great deal of fortitude, who was also invested in what was going to happen in the outcome of this ending of the relationship. The court did agree to grant Annie $150 a month in alimony, granted her temporary custody of the children, and which is not unusual in the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, it's fairly common for judges in cases involving the divorce and the disposition of what happens to the kids to automatically assume mothers should get the kids. Motherhood, much more important than fatherhood in terms of raising children. Not the same in early America. Thomas, in his counter motion, requested that the court unfreeze his assets so he could pay the builder of the home that he built for his family in South Bexley, now 850 College Avenue. He owed $950 on the house to a Civil War builder, Wesley Limes, and he wanted the court to grant him that so that he could finish that, pay his debts, and the court actually granted him. His reply to Anna in the divorce proceedings suggested that he was not the monster that she portrayed him to be. He accused her of having a quick and violent temper, of being gone from home a lot and neglecting the children, traveling to Chicago and Cleveland on money that he had given her. And he said, "I'm frugal and industrious," which is how he accumulated the money that he was able to buy property and build a home. He accused her relatives of poisoning her mind against him. "They have poisoned her mind," he said to the court, and said she is now violent-tempered. And that's why they've been arguing for the past few months. Thomas also motioned for custody of the children, and I think this is significant in this age, and it will play a role later. Because he said that Annie had taken them to Thornville in Licking County and left them with strangers instead of taking care of the kids appropriately. So he wanted to be able to take care of his soon-to-be 3 little girls after the birth of their last daughter. And eventually, the court will grant Thomas temporary custody every Saturday. Annie will get alimony to live on, and the divorce will be finalized. At the end of all this process, Lethe Pearl is born, the last child, the last Payton child. The difficulty of talking about this is obviously the difficulty of who to believe. And we just can't know that. We really cannot. If you imagine your business splashed all over the pages of the newspaper, what the newspaper might leave out, what the legal record might not record. I do think it's significant that in his last 25 years, the girls chose to live with him and not mom. So let's talk about that and what happened at the end. The Paytons sold their property in Bullitt Park near CSG. They moved to 850 College Avenue, which often gets called Winchester Pike in the records. Annie moves to the west to Mann Avenue, near where OSU East is located today. And she married a street paver named William Coble in 1894. In the marriage license, she called herself Belle Payton. Perhaps she's reinventing her identity. Maybe she was Annabelle, don't know. And she didn't have to work. He was a street inspector for the city of Columbus until he passed away in 1919 of a cerebral hemorrhage. And she remained, in fact, on Hawthorne Avenue, not far from OSU East, not working until 1930 when she was found. She passed away from heart disease. It's interesting that her death certificate has information not from a family member on it. She had children living and none of them gave information about her. So that death certificate does not give us any details that would help us to know who her parents are. And that is really frustrating. What I find also interesting is that she had a fairly acrimonious relationship with Payton and his brothers and sisters after the divorce. She was arrested for assaulting Thomas's sister Charlotte in 1890. Annie even sued her own daughter, Reddy May, in 1921 after Reddy had her mom arrested on a charge of lunacy and malicious assault. So what this tells me is that the relationships in this family, mom, daughters, the Paytons, were not necessarily pleasant ones. So we don't know what kind of other contact they had, but it appears like the Payton daughters and Thomas, they remained close-knit here in Bexley. Annie remained across Alum Creek doing her own thing. This is also when Thomas starts to experience some difficulties as his sisters are aging, particularly his sister Amanda. And I think this is where Mrs. Brown gets the details wrong, but it's kind of in the right spirit. Instead of a daughter who quote unquote went berserk, it's probably Thomas's sister Amanda, who was living in a boarding house on Main Street in 1903 when a man showed up and according to the newspaper, tried to put the moves on Amanda. That's what the newspaper said. And with the goal of taking Amanda's property from her. And Thomas had to take her to a doctor, and two judged her mentally incompetent. So this is probably the family member who quote unquote went berserk. Thomas became her legal guardian, and he signs for her in property transfers until she passes away in 1911. His brother Gabriel passed away in 1902 from uremia, and they would all end up in Green Lawn. So I think that also is a testament to sort of the close-knit nature of this family as well. Amanda, when she died, left her property to her niece, Amanda Gates, and the family actually sued to break the will on the grounds that that Amanda was not mentally competent when she made it. And courts actually agreed and set aside Thomas's sister's will. In those years when Thomas and his family were passing on and away, Bexley changed very significantly. Between 1889 and 1910, Bexley would become a village, 1908, the incorporation of Bexley. New subdivisions would appear at a record rate in the area of North and Central Bexley. Many of these subdivisions would be listed as restricted. And you can see from this map how the subdivisions are starting to appear. Thomas Miller's farm, Round and Nouse, Callender and Laughlin, which became Bullitt Park. Even South Bexley around Capitol is being turned into houses at a pretty rapid rate.
Here is a plat map for Bullitt Park, one of the plat maps. You can see Parkview Avenue and the lots are laid out on Broad Street.
There we go. Apparently I had a annotation in there. It's my doppelganger speaking for me. This is around Drexel Circle, or as they called it, Columbus Circle. So CSG at the property where Josiah Lund's name is located. And then you can see the circle is pointing you to where the Paytons lived at this before it was all sold to Bullitt. This is what's happening. It is making the Bexley that we now know today. But that was a Bexley that was restricted. And I don't use that word lightly because that is the word in almost every single description of property in Bexley. Restricted meant, according to one developer here, that only the persons of the best class would be able to buy a plot of land in Bexley. It would be single-family development homes. There would be no multi-family housing in Bexley. And in fact, a developer tried in the late 20s, and he was soundly turned down by the Bexley City Council. The result was a 500% increase in the tax value of Bexley property between 1900 and 1920. So 500% is added to the value of this community. African Americans like the Paytons will be located in north or the southern portions of Bexley, no longer in the central sections, as the properties there are far too expensive to purchase. And there are African Americans in North Bexley besides the Paytons and South. The Ralston Steel Car Company, which was along Fifth Avenue, the railroad tracks, they're made a particular kind of railroad car. The bottom would drop out. It's called a gondola car. And they employed African Americans from Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. They even built a company town there. So the Bellwood area was a company town and it housed the workers for those factories. There was for a time a planned development there that would result in earthenware and pottery, but it never really got off the ground. Though there are potsherds, apparently, if you go digging up there, you can find pieces of pottery. This restriction that's listed in the deeds, the restricted part, meant that Bexley would develop in a particular way in the 20th century. Very German. I did an analysis of the 1910 census. 72% of the people in the 1910 census had German ancestry. And part of that's due to the area around Capital, but also that North German element as well. And Bexley developers wanted to keep that character, that homogeneous character that was developing here. So we see restrictive covenants appear in the area, with developers like Alexander Forrest, who created Stanberry, making sure that only the right people could move into the community. Okay. There we go. So here's some ads you can see. Bexley Park, developed by Alexander Forrest, the fine homes, Forrest Realty Company, growing suburb, the suburban place. When you read the ads, they're of course really like encouraging you to move to this wonderful, beautiful place where you will find the best class of people. And Forrest really pioneered the idea in this area of using drawings of the prospective houses that would be here to show people exactly what you would get. Not everybody did that. Meanwhile, it's in North and South Bexley that developments are just a little bit slower. So this area around Capital University in 1892, you can see not much going on there, still pretty rural. This is where the interurban was behind Capital, still dirt roads. In fact, in early Bexley, in the early 20th century, people kind of got really mad because if you wanted to improve the streets, that would result in more taxes. And so they would continually go to the city council and say, we don't want to pay for sidewalks and we do not want those brick streets. So you see those in particular parts of Bexley, but not in others. The school system here would have been open to African Americans, and that's where we see Payton's daughters. And this may be the only image that we have of them in South Bexley. So you see the three African American girls on the left-hand side. This could be his daughters. The photo is roughly 1898, between 1898 and 1900, at the school that was known as the Pleasant Ridge School, where Capital University is located today. Later, Bexley would build a bigger one called Bullitt Park School, and they'd outgrow that one. And then we get Montrose, and they outgrow that one, and then we get the high school. So the Paytons are living in South Bexley, where they are not going to be the only African Americans, but the 12 other people that are here are largely not landowners. So who are the African Americans in Bexley that you will see in this age, this time period? They are domestic servants. By the time that Thomas Payton dies in 1915, the area of Bexley will have about 7,000 folks total. There's like a 450% increase in the population in the 1920s, and about 6.5% of those people will have an African-American domestic servant working in their home. You can't afford to move into Bexley unless you've got the money to buy in. And that's in fact what will push the Paytons out. Thomas will leave his land to his daughters. He dies without a will, so they inherit after they go through probate and all that sort of stuff. The oldest daughter dies in 1919. The middle daughter retains the property. And unfortunately for her, she mortgages it for more than she can pay in the mid-20s. And the last of the Paytons will leave Bexley in 1927. We won't see her again in the records until she ends up on Monroe Avenue in Bronzeville on the east side, working as a domestic. In fact, who did she domestically provide service for? The Levesques, i.e. the Levesque Tower Levesques. And interestingly enough, she sued Mr. Levesque because she fell down the stairs in his house and asked for $5,000 in 1930, but they must have worked something out because she was still working for him until her death in 1933. So what are our conclusions here as we're wrapping up? The primary sources don't allow us to tell us the story that we want to tell, the things that we want to know about what happened to these people and their experiences. And the memory of Miss Brown is right in some respects, wrong in others. I wish we could know more about the lived experience of people in Bexley as well. Like, what was it like for Payton's girls to go through the Bexley school system, a school system that did minstrel shows for 3 years running in the late 19th century? What was it like to live in a world where the only people who looked like you worked in a factory or were a domestic in the employ of someone else? Where deeds explicitly and directly said, you cannot buy land in this property. This is a deed from Stanberry in 1938. What's it like to be in a place that's restricted and says, you can't be there, where you are depicted in these ways that we now deem offensive, but were so ubiquitous in the 20s and even through the 50s. Bexley did blackface minstrel shows in the 50s. The last one I can document is 1954. We just don't know. And I wish we knew more. I wish we had the resources and the records to tell us, but that's one of the great silences of African-American history. Many stories we want to tell and no data on which to build those stories. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. 7:54, and you might have questions.
I'll start it off with a question from online. What percentage of Bexley may have been Black in 1860?
Probably no more than 5%. Very difficult to know because people will show up in a census and then not be in the next census. Mobility is very, very much a feature of African Americans. They just show up and then they're gone, show up and then they're gone. The Paytons are in fact the longest running family in Bexley history. So 1868 to 1927.
Digging into the story.
Oh, what sparked the interest in digging into the story? So I work as a trustee of the Bexley Historical Society, so I'm very much interested already in Bexley history. And I teach African American history at the high school, which we'll offer next year. And I started looking at yearbooks, Bexley High School yearbooks, and I would notice African Americans in those yearbooks in the 20s, and I want to know, well, how did they end up here? What was that like to be going to Bexley High School and graduating and being the only African American graduating in 1928 or 1929? So I started unraveling their stories. And I remember one day looking at the maps and seeing T. Payton and thinking, I haven't searched this person yet. So let's see if I can figure out who T. Payton is. And then when I looked in the census and discovered that he was African American and a landowner, it was like a whole door opened.
Do we know if the Paytons still exist? Did the daughters ever have children or get married?
They did. All three daughters got married. The eldest daughter, Katie, who dies in 1919, marries the Napper family. So they're from out east, and they have about, I think, 8 children total. So that family still is around, and they're active in genealogy, as far as I can tell from Ancestry. Reddy May has children. I've not been able to find any great-grandchildren yet because I haven't filled out that part of the genealogy. Lethe Pearl, the last child, marries a man who has multiple children from different relationships. And they actually divorce in 1940, and she manages to live until 1966. So I have no indication exactly what the relationship was with the children that weren't hers. Yes, ma'am.
They travel, you said they travel. And how at that time were they able to travel?
Train. Segregated railroad cars were pretty much a norm, even in the North. Columbus was a fairly segregated city, so African Americans could use Franklin Park only on certain days of the week. Churches on the east side allowed African American congregants, but they had to sit in the balcony. So you could take the train. Thomas and Gabriel, being both wagon drivers, were familiar with travel just via horseback. So they probably spent a lot of time on the road.
The idea that their complexion, the girls were pretty brown, in order to file and court systems, different things like that, they were a lighter complexion.
Sometimes being lighter complected gets you certain advantages in the 19th and 20th century. The description of Thomas is that he is very dark. His enlistment describes him as very dark. The daughters appeared fairly dark as well. We don't have any pictures of Annie, as far as I can tell. She seems to have died alone and without anyone in her circle to look after her.
About the relation between Bexley and surrounding neighborhoods. Because it seems that basically, why, I mean, was always the case economic, redlining.
So Bexley started out as farmland, so it's much more available for people to move in. African Americans as tenant farmers, the Paytons being able to buy property. It's only in the 1890s when the subdivisions start to creep in that developers see the potential, the economic potential for Bexley. And that's creeping along Broad Street. Broad Street is the corridor leading out of downtown. And you see mansions popping up. Drive down Bryden, for example, and see the very, very large houses that pop up in the 19th century. And as they do so, they're getting closer and closer out this way. Bexley, what it offers originally, the people move here, is farm acreage that you can turn into a country estate. And they even advertise. My favorite advertisement line from this time period by one of the developers is, "Tickle the land with your hoe and watch your produce grow."